Okay, good morning. This is lecture number 2 for the interpreting in superior courts misdemeanor cases. So last week we were looking at the California Judges Bench Guide. We're looking at the different the script for California Judges Bench Guide Part 1. I asked you to study the material from lecture 1, which is actually this material from the class manual. This material, which is Misdemeanor, Advisement of Rights, Waiver, and Plea Form. I also ask you to go to the laboratory and in the laboratory for this class, go to where it says California Judges Bench Guide Part 1 right here, and to download the script and work on the script, which is this script that you see on the screen. I also ask you to review the lecture, and I told you that we were going to be working on California Judges Bench Guide today, and we will. I'm going to monitor you towards the end. You really need a little bit more time to digest all this material. That's the way I feel it. So I look at this lecture 2 as being your opportunity to do some interpretation on your own without the pressure of being monitored. But towards the end of the lecture today, I will do that if I feel that that it is the right thing to do. Honestly, in lecture 2, I let you interpret, but you got to interpret out loud, obviously, right? And see how it goes, and for you to start identifying the issues and so on and so forth. So today, it's a day where we're going to be doing a lot of practice, and we're going to look at the material under lecture number 2, which is going to be the waiver, advisement of rights, and plea form, but it's going to be for the DUI cases. So we're going to start with that today, and then we're going to get into the practice. Let me see if I find here it is. Okay. So you can see on the screen, this is something you already studied, hopefully. But now when we go to lecture 2, we have a DUI advisement of rights waiver and plea form. And this one is a pretty long form. In fact, it's so long that I'm going to give you 2 weeks to read it and to work with it. Because 1 week, it will definitely not be sufficient. The idea behind this form, why do we have a different form now? Why is there a different form? Well, the first one that you studied for today, that is the one that is in week number 1, it's just for a general misdemeanor. Whereas the one that you see here right now, which is the one for lecture 2, it's for DUI cases specifically. You will notice when you work in the court system that, as I mentioned last week, these forms are printed in a color paper, and each form has a color. The first one, the lecture 1, was blue. This one, it's going to be, I believe it's green, if I'm not mistaken. So, and that's because, and there are many other colors as well, and that's because some crimes come with their own forms simply because the crimes have conditions of probation that are unique for those crimes. In this case, however, one of the main things that happens in a DUI case that doesn't happen in any other case is, or DUI or suspended license case, is that the DMV is involved in this matter somehow. You see, you have a driver's license, and if you drive under the influence of alcohol, that driver's license may be restricted, and you can only use it to go to work and come back from work. And if they find that, if you commit this crime for more than 2-3 times, you may lose your license. So technically what happened is that the DMV it's kind of involved in this criminal proceeding, because driving is a privilege, it's not a right. You will eventually people that lose that privilege can go to the DMV and have a hearing there with an interpreter as well, and in that DMV hearing is an administrative hearing. What the defendant is going to try to convince the DMV that he should be given the driver's license back. But at this point, we are in the criminal jurisdiction. In the criminal jurisdiction, there are some rights and there are all these things that you have already studied. And if you look at these things, they are all going to be exactly the same. So there is some good news about this. That form that you studied for this week, that form, the material, the rights that are there, plus some other material, it's going to be here as well. So you can see that the very beginning, page 11, it's about the same. But then page 12 gives you specifically crimes associated with driving under the influence of alcohol. 23-152A, 23-152B, D, and so on and so forth. Keep in mind that driving under the influence of alcohol, it's penalized not by the criminal code, but rather by the vehicular code. It's a code that specifically refers to using a vehicle, usually driving a vehicle. So the sections are a little bit different, and the code is certainly very different. In fact, you can see here that it says, I understand that I'm charged with a violation of vehicle code. And that's the code that deals with DUI cases. Now, for a person to be legally drunk, that person has to have 0.08% of blood alcohol level, nivel de alcohol en la sangre. If that person has that amount or more, then that person is considered to be drunk, even though that person may very well be able to drive a car. But under the eyes of the law, that person will be considered to be a drunken driver. The more you have, the more concentration of alcohol, in other words, the higher that amount is, that blood alcohol level, let's say 0.21, that's really bad. That's actually worse, right? So in a DUI case, everything is pretty much the same as we have already discussed in terms of getting an offer and so on and so forth. But there are so many DUI cases that the offers are what they call standard offers. So the first question that we have is, how do you say in Spanish standard offered? Oferta común. Oops, sorry, you don't see it. Let's put it there. Standard offered, oferta común. So you will hear, for example, the attorney for the defense asking the DA in the courtroom, in this particular DUI case, can you give me an offer in the case of Jose Perez? And then the DA will say, I'll give him the standard, which means la oferta común, la oferta regular, if you want to use regular. It basically means la oferta típica. I mean, if you want to say something, we don't use that. This is more like an explanation. The best option, of course, is this one. That's the best option. So both parties know what the offer is, if it's the first time, and that offer is going to be including certain things that are different than when an offer is given for a general crime. For example, this offer is going to include, the ability, maybe going to some type of AA meetings, maybe to go to the morgue to see victims of drunk driving, or maybe to go to sessions from MAD, which is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So there are different type of requirements, and those requirements will be placed on the conditions for parole. Rarely somebody who commits this crime for the first time will go to jail. However, the punishment is mainly financial, because the cost is pretty big, and it's a lot of money you're going to be spending if you're driving under the influence of alcohol for the first time. and the money involved with the fact that the car was towed away and is kept in a yard, en un depósito de automóviles, and in un corralón you could use for a yard as well, and then of course you have to pay for it. So there are some, there's a lot of requirements that are associated with that. So when you look at this right here, the very beginning, the first thing is just a different type of DUI cases. Typically, it's either 23152B is the typical one that we hear, which basically is driving when my blood alcohol level, nivel de alcohol en la sangre, is 0.08 or higher. Now, there could be also a case for someone who's driving a commercial vehicle with a blood alcohol level in excess of 0.04%. 0.04%. You can see that for a commercial vehicle, it's more. There, to be drunk, you have to have half the concentration of when you drive a regular vehicle. Then there is also 23103, 23103.5, which is driving recklessly involving alcohol or drugs. And what that really means, you're going to learn that. We'll learn that shortly. But that means that sometimes the blood, say for example, your blood alcohol level is 0.08. Okay, so according to this standards, you are considered to be drunk. But what happens is that those machines that actually measure your blood alcohol level, which have different names, one of the typical ones that is used is intoximeter. We translate that as sensor de alcoholemia. Alcoholemia. No es intoxímetro, it doesn't make any sense. Because intoxicate, when you say, were you driving intoxicated in English? And it refers to alcohol, right? So you wouldn't say to that person in Spanish, usted estaba conduciendo intoxicado, because the Spanish-speaking individual will probably take the word intoxicado as food poisoned, because that's what it means in Spanish. So if this exchange could actually happen. Sir, in court, right? Sir, were you driving intoxicated? Señor, ¿estaba usted manejando intoxicado? No, si yo no había comido. No, I didn't even have anything to eat. Yeah, I know you didn't have anything to eat, sir, but were you intoxicated? Sí, yo sé que usted no tuvo nada que comer, pero ¿estaba usted intoxicado? Pues no estoy intoxicado si no comí nada. So you see, the understanding of the word intoxicado in Spanish implies food poisoned. The legal term in English for intoxicated is more like being under the influence of either alcohol or drugs. So the best translation for intoxicated, if it is under the influence of alcohol, is embriagado. So let me write that here. Intoxicated. If it's alcohol, you can say ebrio. Embriagado. Try not to use borracho. But if it is drugs, you will be obviously drogado. Sorry. So, sir, were you intoxicated when you were driving your car? Referring mainly to alcohol. Señor, ¿estaba usted embriagado cuando conducía su automóvil? If it's drugs, and the question is, were you intoxicated? ¿Estaba usted drogado? So the intoximeter has it's a device, it's sensor de alcoholemia, that has a certain tolerance, meaning that if you read 0.08, the actual value is going to be plus or minus 0.00000001. So if you take the minus, when you subtract to 0.08, that little number, which is 0.00000001, you end up with a level that it is not really 0.08 again, it's a little bit less. Now, if you add it, you add with something that is a little bit more. So the actual reading, by the way, the word reading is lectura in this context. The actual reading from that intoximeter, la lectura real de ese sensor de alcoholemia is anywhere between 0.07999999 and 0.08000001. So, whichever value you want to pick, one takes you into the area where you're not drunk because you have not reached 0.08. The other one does. So sometimes these intoximeters, they always produce results in that format. So when somebody is under the influence of alcohol because he has a blood alcohol level of 0.08, sometimes it is the DA decides to charge with reckless driving involving alcohol. That's called in the court wet reckless, which in Spanish is manejar después de tomar alcohol. See, how much it doesn't say, and obviously it's going to be less than 0.08, otherwise they will charge you directly with that, which is the 23152A, which is driving under the influence of alcohol. So a wet reckless, manejar después de tomar alcohol, which really means that we don't know how much alcohol you had, and we don't care, but you're not supposed to drink any alcohol anyway. So a wet reckless, it's kind of a crime that it's a very minor crime, honestly. And there is really very little consequences to that, because you can drink alcohol and not be drunk, and as long as you have less than 0.08, then they shouldn't be charging you. But the DA will charge you for wet reckless because you're really close to it. You got 0.079999, but the punishment is minimum. But what the DA wants to do is to put this in your criminal record, so that if you drive under the influence of alcohol again the next time, this wet reckless is considered to be a prior, meaning that the next time you drive under the influence of alcohol is considered to be your second time, which has a lot more punishment. That wet reckless, of course, we also have dry reckless. And this doesn't mean that it is under the influence of alcohol, because that what it really means is manejar sin haber tomado, manejar negligentemente, sin haber tomado alcohol. You could put negligentemente here too, manejar negligentemente. So a wet reckless is manejar negligentemente después de tomar alcohol. Let me just remove so you can see the whole thing. Give me 1 second. So wet reckless is manejar negligentemente después de tomar alcohol, whereas a dry reckless is manejar negligentemente sin haber tomado alcohol. So when somebody drives under the influence of alcohol and the blood alcohol level is 0.08, then these two terms may come in. I mean, this term, the first term, which is wet reckless. Because it's clear that that person had alcohol, but not enough to convince the jury that the person should be convicted of driving under the influence, for the crime of driving under the influence of alcohol. So there are different scenarios when dealing with DUI cases. This 0.08 is one scenario. Usually these DUI cases do not go to trial. And the reason why they do not go to trial is because if the reading is 0.09, you're already legally drunk. So no matter what if you go to trial, you're gonna lose the trial. If the reading is 0.08, then they usually give you wet reckless, and that prevents any potential of going into trial. Now, sometimes these cases do go to trial. Imagine that your blood alcohol level is 0.083, but you had some type of a cough medicine or something that actually has alcohol in its compound. In its cough medicine comes with alcohol in it. So now the question is it the alcohol that you drink to get drunk, or is it the alcohol how much of that percentage corresponds to the alcohol that was taken because you were feeling sick or whatever? Because then that shows that you didn't intend to drive under the influence of alcohol. You just simply didn't know that the cough medication has alcohol. So in those cases, you may end up in trial, and therefore you need to interpret those trials, of course. And usually it has to do with cough medication. So that's one option. Another option is look at this scenario. Suppose that you are driving a car, and then you park the car, and you stay inside the car and you take a nap. And then the police comes in and knocks at your window. And when they knock at your window, you roll down the window, and the police can smell alcohol. Were you driving under the influence? Well, you were not driving, you're inside the car. Well, the police will touch the hood of the car first to see if that hood of the car is still warm. If it is warm, the police is going to charge you with DUI, because it's assumed that you had to drive there, and you probably did because it was warm, right? The hood of the car is warm. So that means that you're drunk there. You're not driving at the moment that the police actually knock at your window, but you were drunk when you drove there because it had just recently happened. So those cases sometimes go to trial. But in general, most of the cases that are DUI cases, they do not go to trial. And therefore everything is pretty standard. And I have to tell you, if you work in DUI court, it is so busy that sometimes you have up to 5 interpreters, because you need definitely at least 1 or 2 interpreters when the attorney for the defendant interview the defendant. And then you need 1 or 2 interpreters to read this form in the cell if the person is in jail. And then you need 1 interpreter to read this form if the person is in the audience. So it's a pretty busy courtroom in terms of Spanish-speaking interpreters. So the form that we are actually is of our interest this week. It has all these options, and it also has the 14601. That's the one that you driving with a restricted, suspended or revoked license. This could be the result. See, when they restrict your license, is because you were driving under the influence of alcohol, and you were punished for it. You're paying the price for it. But if it's still the license is restricted, if you drive and they catch you, the police catch you, then what happens is that you're going to be charged with any of these sections. Not as serious as DUI, but there is a punishment associated with it. Now, on page 13, it talks about someone, a habitual traffic offender, is someone who generally has a history of driving without a license, or driving with a suspended or revoked license. So that's also, so there is a difference between you drive without a license once versus you're driving without a license and you're caught 15 times. So after 3 times, they call you a habitual traffic offender, which carries more punishment, obviously. Each time they stop you because you don't have a driver's license. Then 8 is the offenses. 9, it talks about the former convictions, former crimes that you committed and you were found guilty. And then 10, if you violated any probation order in any case. And then you just basically state that you understand the charges and the possible pleas and defenses. Then comes the constitutional rights, which are identical to what you have seen already. So this is kind of simple. So you can see it's almost, 2 pages? 1 page. But then suddenly, and that is on page 15, things start changing compared to the previous form. And these are charges that are, rights that you have in regards to charges of another convictions and probation violations. So if you were convicted for a crime in the past, or you violated your probation in the past, then you have a specific right for that, and they are listed here. But they're going to be very similar to the other ones that we have already seen, because there are no new rights. Then you have to waive your right, which is very similar to what you've seen in the same form, in the previous form. Then you have your consequences of the plea, right, which is similar to what you've seen in the other form, except that on page 17, there is a consequence in this case of that plea that it is not in the previous form, the one that you studied for today. And that is that if the Department of Motor Vehicle may consider any of my other convictions for DUI, blah, blah, blah. So here's a specific, and here's the first time that the DMV is introduced. Department of Motor Vehicles here in California. The translation for Department of Motor Vehicles no es Departamento de Motores y Vehículos, because nobody takes engines there. This has nothing to do with motores y vehículos. Es la Secretaría de Tránsito. That's the translation provided to you. Most people know it as El DMV, but you have to transfer it correctly. You can't say El DMV. And then it talks about the fines and the consequences of that fine. And then it talks a little bit about it. If you are under the influence of alcohol, that impairs your ability to safely operate a motor vehicle. This number 27 is known as a Watson warning in law. It's a warning that was approved by the courts after the case of the People versus Watson, and that basically tells the defendant that if they what could be the consequences of the defendant driving under the influence of alcohol, and then what will be the consequences in case you kill somebody driving under the influence of alcohol. So that's 27 is new. It's on page 17. And that's all you're going to have to study for next week. So we're going to stop it at page 17. And then there are many more pages, but we don't have to worry about it at all. Right now, it's only up to and including page 17. So in terms of page numbers, you should study from lecture number 2, everything from page 11 to page 17, including pages 11 and 17. Now we do want to see, now we're going to do a practice, but then after that we're going to mix it up with an explanation as to what actually happens in a typical DUI court, in terms of what the interpreters are supposed to do and how this works and the dynamics of it. If we have time today, I will play a tape from DUI court that you will be able to hear. The judge, you will be able to hear the interpreter, and so on and so forth. So you become familiar with the dynamics of that particular courtroom. If not, if we don't do it today, we'll do it next week. But DUI court is so busy, and we are so much in demand, Spanish interpreters are, that you need to handle this very, very well. You can see that the form for DUI that you read after the defendant takes the standard offer or the offer, it's going to be very lengthy, much longer than the previous one, so it will take longer. So be aware of that. So now let's just jump to practice, okay? So let's do some practices for at least 20, 30, 40 minutes. We want to do some simultaneous practices of something that you have already studied in the past, such as pre-trials, and then we want to do a practice on something similar to California Judges Bench Guide Part 1. Don't worry, I'm not monitoring you, but I do want you to speak up. Don't interpret in your head. Speak up. This is really critical. Otherwise, you're not learning. Okay? Otherwise, you're not learning. So having said that, let's get into our first practice, which will begin in approximately 20 seconds. Thank you.